In this lesson, we're going to create a very simple environment to get acquainted with the terrain editor. Alright, so let's go ahead and create a standard terrain inside of our view here. So let's just left click and create that. And it looks like this is going to be that 2048 by 2048 that we used in a previous lesson. So let's delete this and resize it. So to do that, we right click on a terrain editor. And let's change this to 256. Well, actually, let's go to 512 by 512. Here we go. Let's make sure that we have the numbers right there, and then we'll hit OK. And this is going to bring up our terrain editor. Now, inside of the terrain editor, we have some similar interface layouts here that we have with the main interface. So in the terrain editor, we have what resembles the object toolbar, and this is where we can actually create the different types of terrain. So we have mountain terrain, which is what we have by default. We have peaks, eroded terrain, we have canyon terrain, mounds, dunes, iceberg, and lunar. Now all of these are available with the standard terrain. Now if we were to create a procedural terrain, you'll notice that lunar will not be available. Alright, now all of these have to deal with changing the terrain in some fashion. Now all of these at the top are the options to actually control the way the terrain looks inside of our editor here, not necessarily changing anything about the terrain, besides the dividing and doubling our terrain resolution. Now we've already talked about with standard terrains, we really don't want to mess with that too much because it could begin to tear up the detail and pixelate that. Alright, so what I want to do at this point is go ahead and create a terrain that resembles a meadow. Now we're working with a mountain here, and this is very, very rough. And it also varies in altitude at several different points. So let's say that maybe this shape isn't exactly what I'm looking for as far as the elevation goes. I'm not going to worry about the minor or the more high resolution details here. Let's go ahead and talk about changing the overall shape itself. We can do this by clicking on our mountain object, and we'll get a different shape here. And what we want to do is go ahead and cycle through this until we find a shape that we're happy with. Alright, so I really did like that first one because it had a good variation, but I think this one will work too. So what we can do at this point is hit OK, and that's going to change our shape of our terrain in our scene. So let's zoom out and just kind of take a look at what that looks like. We can do a quick render, and this looks nothing like a meadow at this point. So what we need to do is kind of smooth this out here. Now before I go back into the terrain editor, let's rename this terrain. So I'm going to go over to my world browser, and let's rename this to meadow. Now I want to make this a little bit flatter. You'll see that it's pretty high, so let's grab our scale tool and scale this down in the Z direction. So now that's a little bit flatter. And now let's open it up in the terrain editor. Now you'll see that that update has been made, and we still have a lot of this detail in here, and I really don't need this. This meadow is supposed to be really smooth looking. So what I want to do is retopologize this to make it a little bit smoother. Now you may be looking through some of these tools here, and you might see this smooth brush, and you might try to use that, but as you smooth, it really doesn't do a whole lot to that detail. Well, we really do need to go in and just retopologize this. So I want to turn on my wireframe just so we can see this happening here. We have a lot of this very acute detail, and we can see that these polygons are being raised to create that detail. Let's retopologize this by using our retopologize button. So let's retopologize this, and it brings up our dialog box here. Now the only option that we have is looseness. So if we wanted to retopologize it a lot and really smooth it out, we want to take this looseness up. Now if we want to keep some of our details, we want to keep it at a lower number here. So I'm going to go up to about 40 on this and then hit OK. Now it's going to go through its process of retopologizing this, And then you'll see that it really smooths all of this out. We've lost a lot of that acute detail. So this is exactly what I'm looking for. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my wireframe. Now this is a good practice whenever you're working with your terrains in your terrain editor. If you are using any of these options here, especially if they're display options, we want to turn them off before we go into or back into view, into the viewports themselves. Because when we open up the terrain editor later on, one of those options could cause view to become unstable, especially this show texture map. I've had instances where this was turned on and I had a complex scene and it would go ahead and crash the terrain editor or view altogether. So I normally like to just turn those off. Now let's hit OK on this, and you'll see that we have our meadow in here. It's very, very smooth. So let's hit that quick render just to see what that looks like. And at this point, I want to go ahead and create two more terrains. Let's go ahead and get kind of low on this. And let's get a good angle to where we can see a couple of hills. So I can see one right in here, one in the background. And let's create a couple of mountains off in the background here. So we can add in more terrains here. Now, these are going to be background elements. So I'm going to use just standard terrains and keep their resolution kind of low. So I'm going to right click on this and change this from 512 to 256 by 256. Let's hit OK, and I'll hit OK one more time just to bring that in. Let's zoom out in our top view and grab our move tool, and let's just move this off in the directions that the camera is pointing here. So I want this to be off in the background here, and it could be touching this. All we're worried about is what the camera sees. Let's go ahead and create one more terrain. So let's just left click and let's bring this off in this direction. And let's make this front one a little bit larger. So let's scale it up. Let's grab our scale tool. We can hit S on the keyboard to do that. And in our main camera view, let's select all three directions and scale that up. Let's go ahead and move it back by hitting M on the keyboard. And in our top view, let's just move it back some. Let's grab terrain number 4 and let's reposition that a little bit. And I'm pretty happy with that. So we've just created a couple of different background elements. Now we could rename these if we like. I'm not going to worry about that right now. And let's go ahead and come in here and let's double click on our terrain editor for this mountain and let's change its shape. I want something a little bit taller so we can continue to just cycle through these. And let's find something that looks pretty interesting here. That one's a little too round along the top. This one's pretty interesting, so I'll hit OK on this. Okay, that creates a little bit of variation on that mountain. Alright, now let's grab our meadow and let's apply a simple material to this. So I'm going to load material and let's find the right material we're looking for. We go up to, let's see, let's go to Terrainscapes, and I have this spring ground cover. I'm going to double click on that and apply that. Take quick render just to kind of see what that looks like. Pretty happy with that. I like that variation with the dirt and the flowers and things like that. And let's apply a material to these mountains in the background. Let's go to load and let's just apply a natural terrain. Let's use this natural 3, and we'll do the same thing for this other one as well. That should already be chosen, and we'll do a quick render, and there we have our mountains in the background. We've got this nice neat little meadow here, and we've learned how to use a couple of different tools inside of the terrain editor. Now before we move on, let's kind of touch up this meadow a little bit. I want to make a couple of different variations here. So on the meadow, let's double click on it and let's learn how to paint or sculpt our terrain here. So the first thing that we need to know is where all of our sculpting tools are. Well, they're over here in our paint panel inside of our terrain editor. Now we have a couple of different types of brushes that we can choose from in our brush presets. We have 3D brushes and then we have 2D brushes. Now 3D are brushes that are going to orient to the normal of the terrain. So if I select this 3D sculpt brush, you'll see that that little white line is changing direction depending on the normal that it's currently on. Right? Now, you can barely see that because we really don't have a whole lot of major detail, but you can see how that white line is kind of at a diagonal angle there. Now, if we grab our raise brush, this is a 2D brush, and you'll always notice that that white line points straight up in the air. All right? So if we want to create elements that are like overhanging rocks or things like that, we want to use like a 3D sculpt brush. Now, for us, we just want to use this raise tool. So let's go ahead and get into how we can use this raise brush to sculpt inside of our terrain editor. Now that we have a brush selected, let's go down to our global settings on how to control this brush. Well, the first thing that you'll notice is we have airbrush, and airbrush is going to allow us to sculpt or paint by just holding down our left mouse button, and it's going to gradually make those changes the longer we hold our mouse down. Now if we turn that off, we're going to get the change based on these settings here. So if I left click and hold on this, you'll see that it's a very abrupt change. Whereas if I have airbrush turned on, it's a very slight change, and it depends on how long I'm holding over that area, and it gradually increases that detail. Just hit Control Z to go back to that default there. Now we have invert, and obviously this is going to invert whether we are raising or lowering the terrain. Now we have size, flow, and fall off. Size is going to adjust the diameter or radius of our brush. Flow is going to determine the strength of our brush, and then fall off is going to determine the hardness of our brush. So if we want a very soft brush, we want our fall off to be at 0. If we want it to be a really rigid or hard brush, we want it set to 1. Now we have these sets of buttons right next to our size, flow, and fall off. And this is what's going to enable us to use our pen pressure tablets. So if we want to be able to control the size by our pen pressure, we just simply activate this button, and now whenever we use a pen, if I hover over and I start to press on this, it's going to decrease that size there. Now if I press really hard, that's going to apply it. Alright, now let's get into raising some of these areas here. Now my raise brush has this mask applied to it, and we can see that in our brush editor here. Now the brush editor has this mask. Let's turn that off because I just want to use a simple brush here. So now we need to determine where we can actually add in this detail, because I can't tell where my material is, where I'm going to be sculpting or anything like that. So what I can do is actually turn on the show texture maps. Okay, this might help a little bit, but it's not showing up my material. Now we can kind of get a viewpoint of where we need to be by hitting show objects or show entire scene. So we can see our camera, and we can see a little bit of our material applied to this. Now it's very, very low resolution on this. In fact, it's really not even recognizable. But we can tell where we need to be sculpting based on our camera view. So I want to kind of sculpt this hill right in here, make that a little bit higher, and we'll create one a little bit higher up in here. Okay, and we can just adjust these as we go along. Let me take that flow down a little bit, so that way it's a little bit smoother. And you can come in and you can start to experiment and change the shape of this terrain however you see fit. And at this point I want to smooth this out, so I'm going to use my smooth brush to smooth out what I've just painted, or sculpted I should say. Alright, so now those hills are very subtle again. They don't have that weird bumpiness in there created by the brush preset. And now that we're finished, we can hit OK on this. And then here's what we have in our scene. So if I render this out, this is what that looks like. Now, what I want to do is I want to move my camera a little bit just to kind of see those mountains again. So we've got a good looking hill here. Let's render that out, and you can definitely see that. Now you could lower that if you wanted to by using that invert on your brush. So let's say that that is just a little bit too high. Let's grab our raise tool, let's invert that, and let's just select that and invert that back into our terrain there. Now once we have that, we can hit OK, and you'll see how that lowers. Now again, what happened is that we have all of this bumpiness. We forgot to turn that mask off. Not a big deal because we can just smooth that out. Okay, grab that raise there and smooth that back out, and then hit OK. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at that, and there we go. So now we have our meadow scene created. Now in our next lesson, we're going to get a little bit further into the terrain editor by creating a different type of terrain, and we're going to create a canyon and start working with a few more of those brushes and get a little bit more detail and a little more advanced in that. So I'll see you then.